Hi everyone, welcome back to another episode of the Healthy Home Show. And today I'm delighted to have with me Jeff Charlton, who I've been trying to get on the show for ages because I think his experience and history and everything is absolutely fascinating. His business is called Building Forensics, and he essentially deals with building-related illness. Jeff, thank you so much for spending the time to come on and have a chat with me today, because I'd really love to kind of dig into what you do and what brought you to your business. So if you wouldn't mind starting sort of what got you into mold related, air related issues. I have a feeling, I think I've read somewhere that you have a background in disaster recovery. So that would be really interested to find out more about. But hello.
Yes. Well, I started off as an apprentice blacksmith, and I had a bad motorcycle accident, and I got smashed to bits, and I couldn't do that work anymore. So I ended up in a technical college, and where I was a junior technician, and I worked there for about a year while I recovered. And they helped me get a job in St George's Hospital at Tooting and Hyde Park Corner, as it was then. And I got a job as a junior technician in medical physics. And I ended up there as a senior technician looking after the radioisotopes and radium and things like that. So it was quite a responsible job, but specialising in radiation. And I joined the army, and I went on a training course on surviving tactical nuclear weapons. And I knew everything they said was nonsense, and I challenged the instructor, and quietly, not during the course, and they laughed and said, "What? How do you know that?" And I told them what I did, and they said, "Do you want to become an instructor?" So I said, "Yeah, I'd love to." So I became an instructor in CBRN, chemical, biological, radiological, and nuclear events, and from there, as time went on, I did other things. I left to have a family. I left the hospital after 4 or 5 years. And then I came back into flood and fire recovery and restoration. And then that spread into death scene cleanup. And then it spread into cannabis farms and then meth labs. So I started to do the chemical, biological stuff that I had done became very useful. And then I got invited. I was cleaning the front of the National Gallery at Trafalgar Square. I was doing environmental cleaning, and I got invited over to Sweden to learn disaster recovery properly and become their agent in the UK. This company was called OCAD. They was owned by 4 of Europe's biggest insurance companies. And so they put me through every department, and it was, just fast. I knew more than everybody else in the company because none of them saw me as a threat. So each department would give me their secrets, and so I learned everything. And just about then, the company got sold, and they didn't want a branch in London, which was really, really fortunate because the Gulf War has just coming to an end, and I realised that I could go to Kuwait. This is the Gulf War One, and I went over to Kuwait, and I was the only British contractor to win contracts with the US Corps of Engineers and the Kuwait government in disaster recovery and decontamination of Kuwait city and government buildings. So that really was a major step forward for me. I had a company in London that had about 25 employees at the time, but I left them and went out to Kuwait. And I ended up with 400 people working for me in Kuwait doing major projects, and ended up with the US Corps of Engineers said to me, "We want you to write a program of works for restoration of Kuwait City. We don't want to bring Americans in because they will work it between them. So we want you to write it." So I wrote it. They invited all the American contractors over to Kuwait, and they came over, and we had a meeting, and they applauded me because of what I had said needs to be done, and they liked it. And from there, I got invited back to the States to teach them disaster recovery. But when I got there, they were just stepping into the mold industry.
Hmm.
And they were, the term at the time was mold is gold, and there was $50 million lawsuits going on. Melinda Ballinger and people like that. It was just massive. And so I started to learn about the mould industry. And at the time, I was an asbestos licensed contractor in the UK, as well as disaster recovery. So I could bring together some of the asbestos protocols into mould, which was different from American. And so everybody loved it. So I became one of the guys that started to set up the IICRC S520, which is
And that
now a
is the
pretty
regulations.
yeah, it's not a regulation, but it's a government recognised standard of restoration. And then I came back to the UK after working in America for a while, and we had some major floods down in Lewis, and I became Commercial Union their first call in disaster recovery, flood damage, etc. And within 2 years, I won 2 Disaster Recovery of the Year awards, which were, very significant. One in 1999 and one in 2001. So I'm probably the only guy that's won a Disaster Recovery of the Year award in 2 different centuries. Um, so I realised that the industry in the UK didn't know what they were doing, and I set up a thing called the British Damage Management Association, and I put £20,000 of my money into forming this association, and I invited all of the UK contractors, insurers, loss adjusters, all of the professional stakeholders to join me in this BDMA, and they did. And we set it up, and I launched it at Lloyd's of London in the old library 25 years ago.
Wow.
And that became, and still is today, the leading disaster recovery organisation. But interestingly, they don't do mould. And that probably explains why after my first year as chairman, I wasn't invited back the second year, because I wanted to take the standards of competence to a higher level that the industry and the insurers didn't want to pay for. What they didn't realise was that doing it right, doing it once, was far cheaper than doing it cheaply and doing it 2 or 3 times and causing people issues. So
Yeah.
they never did recognise that. They never did realise that. And even today, I challenged Churchill, in fact, that they were overpaying by 40%. This was about, I think, 7 or 8 years ago. And they gave me 15 jobs that had already been priced, and I came back 40% cheaper. But not just 40%. I got the jobs done in 3 weeks instead of 4 months, where side-by-side comparisons were made. And I never saw them again or heard from them again because they said I'd embarrassed their buyers, and that was it. So it's a weird world of disaster recovery and mould remediation. So that's how I got into it. It's a long story, I'm sorry.
No, it
But
sounds fascinating. I'm just wondering whether you see, I mean, in terms of mold, I mean, it seems that we're becoming much more aware of the issues around mold in this country, and specifically the effect that it has on us as humans, because I think, just as you alluded to just then, it always feels like the effect that anything has on humans is like an afterthought, basically. We've kind of looked at quite a lot how the environment is affected, but we don't seem to make the link that, damage to the environment is damage to human beings, because we're all kind of interconnected so much. But I'm just wondering whether there is a difference in the way that you would have dealt with mold in America, whether they have more issues around mold than we do because of the way they construct buildings. And also, whether they are dealing with it better than we are, because I see a lot more kind of court cases going on around mold in the States than in the UK. But I don't know whether that's because that's coming to the UK or whether we just have different buildings, so we're not going to have quite the same amount of issues. So I'd love your take on that.
Well, it's a really good question. It's broad. The first thing, one of the interesting things I found when I was in America, I was on a training course on environmental health, on a specific feature of it. And one of the guys that was on the course with me, his name's Ed Cross, and he's a lawyer. And he wanted to know about environmental hygiene and environmental health. So he was on the same course as me. It was I think it was a 4-year or 5-year training course. And he was on it with me. And he said to me one day, he said, Jeff, I'm in court tomorrow. He said, you might want to come along and see what happens. So I said, I'd love to. So I went along with him and I sat with him and he was in court. And he was the plaintiff. He was the guy that was charging, he was suing uh, a very wealthy film star who'd sold a house to his client and they'd got very sick. And because he was an environmental hygienist and a lawyer, he was doing the questioning. And so he got cross-examined. And the defense barrister or lawyer put him in the box and said, Mr. Cross, isn't it true that mold is gold and it's just something that's a new phenomenon that you've all jumped on the bandwagon for? And Ed picks up the Bible that he just sworn an oath on to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. And he held the book up and he said, Your Honour, if I may, in the good book of the Old Testament in Leviticus 14, everything that we want to do in this mold-affected home is written in Leviticus 14. Nothing has changed in 3,200 years since the Old Testament was written. And it's absolutely true. If you follow the guidelines in the Bible, it's exactly what you should be doing today in our country, in any country. And it's funny, I opened an office in Dubai a little while ago, or nearly a year ago, and people said, You're mad, there's no water in Dubai. And I said, there's water everywhere, and you just don't know where that water is. And the thing is that the mold is in their air conditioning systems from dew point condensation, because it's air conditioning, and other things too. So nothing's changed. Mold was a problem in people's homes 4,000 years ago. And one of the things in Leviticus, what made me laugh, was he said they'll wash it off, and if it comes back after a week, they'll wash it off again. And if it comes back and it's different colours and starting to become looking differently, then you have got leprosy, and you should take that building apart stone by stone, brick by brick, and take it to an unclean place outside of the city, which is, of course, a toxic dump and its demolition. So that's about where we stand today, if it was that bad. I mean, I've not seen a house that I would say demolish, but at the same time, if I see porous materials that are really, and it keeps coming back after you've cleaned it off, then you really need to replace them.
Wow, I mean, that's the first time I've ever heard like a biblical reference to mold, and that's crazy. But I mean, it kind of makes sense, as in, mold and bacteria and viruses are all part of our environment and always have been in our bodies, etc. So I guess why wouldn't it have been around then? But what I'm interested in is it then that we've only just worked out how bad it is for our own health? Because presumably, if they mentioned that in the Bible, and they must have known it was damaging for their own health. So why is it that it's taken us so long in society? Because I always have these questions with these conversations with architects and stuff, and it always fascinates me that I feel that we've put form before function whenever we built buildings for so long, and they all look beautiful from the outside or whatever, but the human being who occupies that property, it feels like they've been an afterthought basically for so long. And it feels finally now that we're talking about how human health is related to air quality or water quality or acoustics within the building, and how to kind of optimize that space for human health. But when it comes to mold, it feels like it's only just come on the scene. And it's taken us so long to kind of deal with it effectively.
Well, as I just said, it hasn't just come on the scene. Yeah. They knew about it and they called it leprosy then. There's some issues, and the issues are these. Everybody follows regulations, and you've got to look at one thing. I mean, I've been on, I don't know, probably half a dozen standard committees writing standards, and I've walked out on half of them, because you realise that the people who paid to write those standards have all got a vested interest. And you don't get any and I was going to say you never get a vicar writing a standard, but you can't trust vicars as much as you can't trust anybody. I remember, and I say that because I stood on an altar in a very big church, and it had a fire on the altar, and I said to the vicar, he said, "I've got to get the church open," and I said, "That looks like asbestos down there." He said, "No, it's not." He said, "I've had it tested. It's not asbestos." And I thought, you know what? I think it is asbestos. So I took a sample. I had it analysed overnight. I went back and saw the vicar, and I said to him, or as a priest, I said, "Can we meet up again on the altar where we were standing?" He said, "Yeah." And I went up there and I said, "See that man up on the wooden cross there?" I said, "He listens to everything we say, doesn't he?" He said, "Yes, my son, yes." I said, "Well, you told me that wasn't asbestos. You had it tested." And I said, "No, I just had it tested. It is asbestos. And you was likely to kill me and my colleagues because of your lies. How do you feel about that?" And, and I think you can't trust anybody with safety except your own instinct. And so, yeah. One of
So
the things that
essentially, it's just profit driven still.
yeah,
And that you don't
yes.
think that there's enough regulations coming in to kind of balance that out. As in, do you think there's still a lot of resistance from people around the kind of money that's in this industry that we need to kind of put into retrofitting properties or remediating them against mold? Yeah, I'm just wondering if we're ever going to get to the point that we take it really seriously.
Well, we do take it seriously, but the thing is that the money takes it more seriously. And let's look at a couple of things. We've got some regulations. We've got BREEAM and we've got LEED. Now, BREEAM and LEED are the two regulations that must be complied with when you open up a new commercial building. And guess what? Fred Flintstone could have wrote these. It's how do you test if the building or factory or office block is safe? Well, we measure nitrogen dioxide. Well, so what? That's car exhaust normally. Carbon monoxide, car exhaust, or carbon dioxide. It's not enough ventilation. They don't measure any of the 100 different components that should be measured in a new build. And so they're ignoring them because of the cost of testing and because of the cost of ongoing maintenance. Because if you say, "I'm going to test for it now," it means you've got to test for it next year, the year after, and every maybe 3 months. So there are issues with established standards that are just not fit for purpose. So I see, quite often I get people say, "Oh, we follow the IICRC S520 mould remediation standards." And I say to them, "Really?" I said, "Who wrote the scope of works?" "Well, we did." I said, "Well, you're not supposed to. The standard specifically says that you should get an environmental hygienist to write the standard. Who does your clearance?" Well, we do. We use a swab." I said, "Well, swabs are not enough for clearance, and you shouldn't be using swabs for clearance. And you should be using a third party for verification." "Oh, really?" "Yes." "Well, you haven't read the S520 and you're not registered as a company with the IRCRC. So there is nothing that I would believe from any contractor that I see or hear or follow. I'm afraid they will all say everything's fine and we've done a great job, haven't we? And it's funny, one of the things I found was that when I did audits for insurance companies, this was quite a few years ago, I'd knock on the door and say, "Hello, my name's Jeff Charlton. I'm from Building Forensics. I've come to investigate if the contractors did a good job on your flood damage." "Oh, they were fantastic. Oh, he was lovely. And he bought me a beautiful bunch of flowers and the chocolates he gave me." And then I started to realise that the bigger the bunch of flowers and the bigger the box of chocolates, the worse job that they'd done. And I'm afraid tells a story of life for
Yeah.
contractors. It's a nice straight tie, shiny van, box of chocolates, and he's everybody's favourite. So yeah, I think the standards, there are no standards, and we start looking now. Let's get to the point of today. We've got AWAB's law coming out this year in October that's supposed to look after tenants in properties. And I'm afraid it was written by someone that has no idea about mold and someone who's no idea about biological contamination. They seem to think that it's important to do it quickly, but if you're doing something badly or wrongly quickly, you're just going to exasperate the issues that you were sent there to remediate or to prevent. And so when the law comes out, if AWEB was alive the day after his law comes out, he would be dead even quicker. So it's got to be stopped. I'm going to challenge it because it's just nonsense. There is no clearance testing. And again, when we look at clearance testing, you could say, well, what is clean? When is the job done? Well, the job's done when the people don't react to whatever that contamination was, and you've reduced the risk to a level that the people do not react anymore to. Now,
Okay.
it could be 1,000 spores per cubic meter for one person. It could be 50 for someone that's got, chronic fatigue or they've got a serious inflammatory response. So there will never be standards for clearance, but there will be guidelines for professional people to make assessments on this should be okay for you. It's like Hurts Me Too, which is a pretty good assessment of 5 toxigenic mold species, that if you get a level over 15 and certainly over 20, it's probably not going to be safe for you to enter that property.
Mm-hmm.
But few people actually do Hurts Me Too. It's done in America when you go to an environmental hygienist or you go to a mold doctor in America. So I'm sure. I mean, we do a lot of. I do a lot of Hurts Me testing for people. So people are getting to grips with it, and it's funny, since COVID, when I if somebody phoned me up and they wanted to talk about mold, and I start talking, and then they would start telling me, I want to do this, I want to do it, and suddenly after COVID, I realised that people had spent an awful lot of time googling stuff and researching stuff and going to chat groups, and I'm afraid this is another fatal flaw in that not all, but a lot of the chat groups have got people that are allowed in and some that are not allowed in. I'm not allowed in any of the chat groups because I'll just say, this, I won't challenge the person, but I'll say, oh, they've just said they're gonna decontaminate it with a dry fog. It
Yeah.
won't do anything. There isn't a dry fog that will work. There isn't a chemical that will kill mold to remove all of its components that are harmful. So
And
it's
why is
just a
that?
question.
So
Why is that?
just to make it clear for people, because I'm kind of wanting to bring solutions to people who are thinking, God, I've got mold in my bathroom. Should I be worried about it? What can I do about it?
Okay.
In your
Okay.
opinion, what's the kind of like the steps of the process that they should go through to be able to
Okay.
kind of make it as good as possible for their own health?
Well, that's a good question. Right. First thing, if the mold is on plasterboard and that plasterboard has got wet enough for mold to grow on the side that you can see, it's almost certainly going to be on the side you can't see in a cavity. If it's a solid masonry wall and it's only on the side that you can see, just wash it off. Just soapy water, just wash it off. If it's on tiles and you're going to get mold in grout, then I would say wash it off and maybe use a scouring pad in between the tiles. You can buy some products that will, I'm going to say the word bleach, but I don't use bleach for bleaching purposes. Well, I do. It might be used just to turn the black stain white, but bleach does not kill mold. It just aggravates mold. So you shouldn't use bleach to try and kill mold. It's a really bad idea. There isn't any regulated or recognised authority in the world that will tell you to kill mold. Everybody that's got any sense will say, don't kill mold, remove mold. And I think probably one of the most significant factors that should be understood is that dead mould is 40 times more hazardous than live mould. I think that's a significant point that people should recognise when they start thinking, oh, I've got somebody coming and they're going to kill all the mould. No, that's really bad. And I suppose I should, do you want me to explain that?
Yeah, please. That would be great. I'd love to know that. I didn't know that that was more hazardous.
Okay. A mould spore is somewhere, approximately, let's say 20 microns. You could get a full stop in a newspaper is 60 microns. So 60 microns, you could get 3 or 4 mould spores on a full stop in a newspaper.
Huh.
Now, our nose will stop 10 micron, and the ciliary hairs in the top of our thorax, that will stop down to about 7.58 microns. So we could end up with needing to blow our nose, clean our nose, or it gets stuck on the ciliary hairs in our upper respiratory, and we end up coughing up. So that's human defences. Now, when we get below 7 micron, those small particles bypass the nose, bypass the ciliary hairs, and they go deep down into the lower respiratory system, which is the alveoli. Now, the alveoli is where the blood oxygen transfer occurs. And so those small fragments will go down into those little sacs that look like bunches of grapes. So they actually then move directly into the bloodstream. Now, what does that mean? Well, when we had the spore that was a whole 20 microns, it contained some chemicals and mycotoxins. And I'm not focusing on mycotoxins, I'm focusing on the chemical mycotoxins because they're chemicals and they are some of the most toxic chemicals in the world. But when that spore breaks up and desiccates or dries out or gets burnt or whatever you think you're going to do with it, that 20 micron goes into 0.1 of a micron, 2 microns, 3 microns, tiny, tiny, tiny stuff that act like a gas and go straight into your bloodstream, carrying those toxic chemicals.
Mm-hmm.
Now, those toxic chemicals are now going into your bloodstream, and the World Health Organization estimate that it's maybe 20, 30, 40 times more higher dose breathing in dead mould fragments than living in a room with whole mould spores. So,
Okay, and because you're basically killing it, it's making it so small that your body's own defenses can't filter it out.
correct. So it's
Okay.
going straight into your bloodstream and whatever that chemical might be. So that some chemicals are neurotoxins and they will affect your memory, they will affect your balance, they can lead to Parkinson's, maybe motor neurone, Alzheimer's. I mean, there's loads of papers now. We've researched lots of them. We're in one of Dow Bredesen, who's a leading Alzheimer's expert and mold expert. He's got a best-selling book stating that Alzheimer's is an inflammatory response, as are many other neurological symptoms, and that reducing your airborne exposure to those toxins can reduce the effect of Alzheimer's, or even maybe, I'm not going to say prevent, but certainly reduce the effect and slow its progression, because it's not just toxins, but it's aggravated. And I've experienced that. I've had some very, very heavy doses of mold exposure where I got to a point where I couldn't talk or walk, and I listed it. It's on my website because I visit so many homes where people feel they're on their own, and what I do is I put my case up and I said, look, I've had 2 heart attacks, 2 strokes, 3 brain bleeds. Couldn't walk or talk. Sometimes, this is one of those sad things that I'm afraid is true. I was at a Christmas party once, and somebody said to me, asked me a question, and I started to talk, and my words were coming out back to front. And my eldest son said, Dad, I think you should go home. You're an embarrassment. Because he thought I was drunk, but I hadn't had a drink, and And I know the battles that people have with their family members who are not sick. And of course, some are sick because they've got the HLA gene, or they spend more time in the home and they get more exposure than somebody else. So there's lots of reasons why some people get sick in the home and others don't.
Hmm. Okay, so what would be your recommendation then for someone if they found mold in their property? What's their first course of action? Not touch it? Get in
No,
an expert?
no, I don't. I think I'm afraid I've got an issue with experts. I recently, um, I recently, uh, I've seen so many companies doing so well from nowhere, and I thought, how do they do that? So I Googled UK mold experts, and up came 20 companies. And I know some of them, and some of them I don't know. And I know they're not experts. And so I went on to Chat GPT and I said, um, who are these 20 companies? Are they mold experts? And Chat said yes. And I said an expert. Expert means they know stuff, and what sort of qualifications have they got? And Chat GPT came back and said, well, they've got a dew point accreditation. And I said, well, that's not an accreditation. That's a 2-day course. That's a beginner's course in mold for beginners.
Hmm.
That's not an expert. They got UKAME certification. That's self-certifying, and they just wrote the course themselves and award themselves certificates. I said, who's out there that has got any recognisable qualifications of competence? And Chat came back and said, none of them. Now, that's, I don't know, that's easy to check, but check you must, because it's very easy to say, you've got to ask the right questions, of course. If you say, who's the mold expert? And it'll come back and say, oh, well, XYZ company.
Yeah.
But now say, what qualifications, and are they verifiable? Are they recognised? Are they experts, not just because they passed an exam, but because they've got the broad experience of an environmental hygienist, which is what it means. And you'll find, I don't know, I might come up, maybe I won't, but I should. And I don't think you'll find anybody else.
And when it comes to, so my main concern is when it comes to mold remediation is that people seem to be using toxic chemicals that are probably just as bad, if not even worse, for your health. So, what's your opinion on that? Do you find that to be the case, or do you find that's just what you need to do?
Well, it's funny, one of the companies that's one of the biggest companies out there, their sister company just got fined in America $500,000 for using chemicals that were unregulated, not licensed. And they use the same chemicals here and say they're non-toxic. Well, the first thing you've got to remember is anything that kills something is toxic.
Mm.
So, and they've got residue. So, and of course, you then got to go back to the previous point. Do you really want to kill it, or do you really want to remove it? So, and if we go to the next question that you haven't asked, is that, and that would be, what do I do if I get mold? And the real answer is what you do is you find out why you're getting mold, because it's pointless trying to remove mold if it's going to
Yeah.
come back, because whatever you do, it's going to aggravate it, and it will come back angry and will start to produce chemicals or mycotoxins to establish its ground. So you need to find out why. So if you've got mold in a bathroom, it's probably because you haven't got enough ventilation. It's probably because maybe if you've got a fan, it's not got enough draw, or you don't, or a lot of people turn them off. If you've got mold in a room or a ceiling, then it's either a leak, or it's because, if it's on a wall, especially an outside wall, it's probably dew point condensation. So you need to find out why you're getting this mold. And if you don't do that, first of all, everything else you do is a waste of time and money. So you find out what it is, and you say, right, I'm going to insulate that wall, or I'm going to put a bigger fan in, or I'm going to stop the leak. But wherever you've got water damage, you will have mold within 48 hours. 48 hours for mold, maybe 24 hours for bacteria. And one of the things that has grown up in the mold industry in the UK is that everybody says, oh, it's mold, it's toxic mold. Well, look, all mold will cause a problem, whether it's an inflammatory response or an allergy, but inflammatory response is the key. So I think people need to realise that if you've got mold, you really need to deal with it quickly, and not leave it to somebody else. And nobody's going to clean it up like you do. Nobody. It's like I always use an analogy of a new mum going into a restaurant. I don't think you'd see a new mum going to a restaurant and say to a waiter, would you ask the chef if he'd mix a bottle up for me, please? She would say, I've got a bottle here. Could I have a saucepan of hot water to warm it up? Nobody trusts people to do things right when it's important. And
Yeah.
your health in a home is important. And I think it's important that you say, how am I going to deal with it? I'm writing a book at the moment. I wrote it now. I'm just about to get it published. And I've split it into different sections. I called it Mold for Dummies, and I was told I can't use that name. So fine, I'm going to change it to something else. I'll get sued. But what will happen is I'm going to put sections on there. There's all different sections, so people can buy 2 or 3 sections, and they can get free papers. I've got free papers on my website. But what's happened is I've got so much stuff. I've had to download it, and I've had to put it all together and create. I think I've got 40 volumes of it, or 40 sections, not volume, 40 sections. But there's a lot. And when I say 40 sections, I think that just about, maybe it's 1 or 2 too many, but it covers different aspects of mold, bacteria, chemicals, and the hodgepodge of everything works in unison. You can get, you can use a chemical to do the. Like, let's make a very simple explanation. If I used a drain cleaner and I used an alkali and put them together, I'm going to get chlorine gas and I'm going to die. So you should never do that. It says so on the pot. It will say, do not mix with drain, do not mix with this, do not mix with that. So you've got to be really, really careful about what you mix. And the minute you put one chemical against another, you've just created something unique, because the dilution factors will be different for every time you do it, unless you measure it out, of course. So I think people need to be careful about what they buy. And, if you were going to use a mold remover, I would just say use warm soapy water with maybe a green pad. And, everybody's going to say, well, look, I can go online, I can buy, I don't know, EC3. Great product. It's non-toxic, but it kills mold. I don't quite understand that. Tea tree oil, it's natural. Well, so's fire is natural, but you wouldn't want to put your hand in it. There's loads of things out there, and I'm not knocking EC3. What I'm looking at is that every one of these products will have benefits and shortfalls, and people must understand what that means. And when we look at cleaning or removing mold, if we look at IICRC S520, for example, that's the standard that lots of people say they want to work to. That is totally insufficient for people that have got mold illness. And so I'll explain that. I think that's important for people to understand. The S520 identifies 3 different categories of cleanliness. There is Class 1, which is active mold growth. Class 2, which is settled spores. Class 3, which is, did I say that there's a normal environment, there's active mold growth, and then there's settled spores. Well, if you're just going to go for, I'm going to remove the mold, that looks fine. So I've washed it off, it looks fine. Oh, but the dead stuff and the stuff that's, if you get a cushion and hoover it for 10 hours and then hit it with a tennis racket, you'll get a cloud of dust come out of it, because the hoover can't pull it from the center of the cushion. But as you keep sitting up and down on a cushion, it will start to move to the surface. So it's about saying, if you've got active mold growth on soft furnishings, you probably need to throw them away. If you've got settled spores on those surfaces, you can probably hoover them away or wash them away. But this is where the IRCRC 520 fell down, was that we're now looking at the fragments, and that's not natural environment, and they don't measure natural environment. So, but what we know, everybody will accept this, people that are suffering from chronic fatigue or SIRS, they're exposed to inflammagens, and those inflammagens are fragments of mold which are not measured by the IRCRC S520. So that's the limitations of it. And whilst people could say we follow the industry guidelines, they are industry guidelines, but they're not the right industry guidelines for someone with mold illness.
Yeah, they're not enough. So in that circumstance, I'm just trying to feel how we can kind of help people that are concerned in their own homes. Would they need to move out, do you think? And when you say you need to remove the mold, not kind of kill it, if it's on walls, how would you do that? You'd actually have to take it back to bare brick.
No. If you've got mold growth on wallpaper, you've got to get rid of the wallpaper. If you've got active mold growth on plasterboard, well, that's a bit different. And there's something here that we now talk about, and we're going to talk about money, because this is about saying, how much money have you got? How much money can you afford to spend? How sick are you? How determined are you? Now, if I had a multimillionaire that was very sick, he'd probably be the meanest man in the world, by the way. But if I've met many. But if we had someone that had a lot of money and was very sick, and they said, I haven't been able to get out of bed for 2 years, what can you do for me? And I would say, well, I'm going to do this, this, this. Well, that would be something totally different from someone who lives in a council flat who says, I've been ill for 2 years, I can't get out of bed, what can you do for me? It's got to be different, because they're not going to be able to afford what I want to do for the millionaire. If I write a report, the local authority or the landlord will probably throw my report in the bin. So I have to approach the client.
Presumably with AWAB's law, they're going to have like a legal obligation to deal with that, in terms of like if you're a housing association tenant or something like that, or even a normal renter.
Well, that's an interesting point, and you think so. Well, look, AWAB law comes out in October this year, and AWAB, I'm going to release a press release on that tomorrow, I think. AWAB was a little boy, 2 years old, who laid on a bed for a year, and looking at mold on the wall. And he ended up dying. And the mum and dad said the council didn't come and remove the mold. It's their fault. Well, that may or may not be the case. Some people might say, well, why didn't they get up and wash the mold off the wall? Well, maybe they did, and maybe it just keeps coming back. I really don't know that history. What I do know is that little boy died, and at his post-mortem, they said he died from granular respiratory restriction, I think it was. And what that meant was his throat closed up to such a point that he suffocated. Now, mold didn't cause that. The mold on the wall didn't cause that little boy's throat to close up. What caused his throat to close up was fragments of mold that are called inflammagens that caused his throat to swell and caused him to suffocate. Now, at the coroner's hearing, they just said, they brought in an expert, and he said the mold that was there was Aspergillus, the most common mold on the planet. Well, of course, the coroner took that, well, this isn't anybody's fault, is it? This is just the most common mold on the planet. But the expert knew exactly what he was doing. He was downplaying it, and he should have said the species of Aspergillus was possibly versicolor or whatever, but it could have been an extremely toxigenic species. He didn't explain that to the coroner. So the coroner just thought, this is the most common mold on the planet. It didn't matter. It didn't matter. He could have walked outside and bumped into it.
Mm.
So it's not fair, it's not right, and I'm afraid lots of people rely on other people's, I'm not going to call it ignorance, but it's they're not aware of the real hazards and risks, and that's why nobody really wants to do something better. Now, when AWAB's law comes out, they've it's trumpets and trombones, and they're going to say, "Oh yeah, we've created AWAB's law." The main criteria is that the landlords have got to respond within 48 hours of someone who's sick. Well, responding to something in 48 hours and then washing it off with bleach is just making the hazard appear faster. So
Okay.
it's doing nothing to reduce the risk. So when you said, oh, there must be laws, well, the laws is that your home is supposed to be safe for you to live in. And if you can prove that the home is making you sick, and you're going to do that with medical records and with maybe analysis of what's in your home, then
Mm.
you've got a chance of, I don't know whether it would be a civil case or a criminal negligence case. I'm involved with 2 cases at the moment. One's criminal negligence from a lady that's in the High Court of Justice who has got extremely sick from mould and negligence of her landlord, or alleged negligence of her landlord. And another one that's in a civil case. So again, you've only got to show within reasonable doubt that in a civil case that, this is probable. This is probable that these people have developed chronic fatigue, irritable bowel syndrome. They've had a menopause at 25, or their hairs fell out.
Mm.
The tests there can show that there's been genetic upheavals, and we can link those to certain inflammagens that may be present in the home. So it's about saying, how much detailing do you want to do with the analysis of the contamination? And that's expensive. And then we say, well, look, if somebody said, I'm really, really sick, I want you to make this home safe for me, how much will it cost? And I want a guarantee. And I would say, you could open your checkbook up and tell me to write a check for whatever amount I wanted. I can't give you a guarantee. And the reason I can't, and nobody can, is that the tiny, tiny fragments that I can reduce, I'm not going to guarantee that I can get rid of all of them, but I
Mm.
can get them down to levels where hopefully they won't affect you. Now, the more I bring it down, the longer I'm on site, the more equipment I'm using, the different protocols I'm going to use. So obviously the more we do, the more it costs. And we have to be, we have to look at what people want, need, and can afford, and be realistic. And that's, when people say how much, and I say, you wouldn't walk into, and is that a reasonable question? People phone up and they say, how much to do
Yeah.
some mould? I've got 1 metre of mould in my house. How much? Well, it's like saying you phone up someone and say, have you got any cars for sale? Yeah. How much are they? What are you
Yeah.
going to say? What do
Okay.
you want to, it's,
Okay, so I can
there's,
foresee issues coming down the line where it's going to be basically struggles between landlords and tenants because, or because basically it's difficult, isn't it? You can't have complete control over how someone's living in the property. And also the landlord cannot have complete control over nature and mold. So then, as you say, it could go on forever and everyone's pointing the finger at each other. Yeah, it's a difficult one.
well, I'll tell you what I've done. I'll tell you what I've done because I feel really, really sorry for, I don't know if sorrow's the right word, but I've got understanding. I've been, as a kid, I was a tenant. I've written papers for tenants that's free. And what I advise them to do is document everything.
uh
And especially now with the new AWAB law, because now the tenant can take the landlord to court within a matter of days, and the magistrate will want to see evidence of mould, evidence that they've made complaints, evidence of illness. Now, that can be a doctor's letter, I've been to A&E twice in the last 2 years, or I've been to the doctors with chest infection 4 times in the last 2 years. That's the sort of thing that a court would want to see.
Okay.
Then you say, "Okay, so I've got some medical records there that's showing that I'm ill." Oh, well, it could be something else. All right, but that's a piece of evidence. Some photographs of the mold.
Mm.
There you go. That's what we've got. And here's my notes when they're called contemporaneous notes, where you just write in your diary and you say, phone the council or the landlord on the 20th of January, 2 p.m., spoke to Fred Smith and told him I've got mold. And their reaction was, oh, we'll see if we can come round. Nobody turned up. Nothing was done. And then you might say, oh,
Okay.
on the 1st of February, so-and-so came, they washed it off with bleach, but they didn't do clearance, they didn't do anything, and we've got it come back. So
Okay. Well, that's
that's enough
useful,
to take to
actually.
court.
Well, I'll point people in the direction of your website, actually, because that would be really useful to have some kind of letters and templates to be able to use. Thank you for that. I am mindful of your time, so I really want to ask you, I want to move off like residents, sort of normal kind of properties if I can, because I know that you work quite a lot with schools. And
Oh,
funnily enough, well, not funnily enough, I don't know what's funny about it, but anyway, I got sent some documentation through from the International Well Building Institute this week, basically, because the well certification system is looking a lot more now at schools as one of their typologies of properties, basically, that they want to put through a well certification program, and universities. And I think I was looking at online, I think there's a university in Dubai, funnily enough, you talking about the Middle East, that has well certified one of their university campuses, basically. So anyway, I wanted to make sure that I spoke to you about schools, because I know obviously children are more susceptible to air quality issues, mold issues, and it's causing such a massive productivity issue. And in studying, also teachers are leaving in droves because they don't feel comfortable in the school environment. So I just wanted to make sure I got some insights from you from that
okay.
before.
Well, I've got some insight for you, and again, I'm going to do some press releases this week on it. Um, I've been saving them up. I was getting to a point where I'm going to do 3 or 4 press releases, but this is what happened to me couple of 2 months ago. I met somebody and they said, I'm a surveyor for a local authority. Would you come along and have a look at a school for me? I said, sure. I said, you sure the local authority wants me? And he said, it's not down to them, it's down to me. And I said, oh. And I said to him, I think this will be the last job you do with the local authority if you bring me in, because they don't like me. None of them, because I know what I'm going to find. Anyway, I went to this school, and this school was less than 2 years old. And as I approached the school, I could see that it had been built wrong. Now, I'm not a surveyor, but I've got a lot of experience, and I could see if a damp-proof course is below or above, the floor, there's something wrong. So the damp-proof course is a black strip you often see. It's bitumen type paper that's between the brickwork. It stops the moisture rising up the wall. Well, this was obviously in the wrong place, so it meant that the walls inside the school would be getting wet at low levels. So I thought, there's, an idiot's passed this. This school should never have been passed for acceptable building. Anyway, we go in and I can smell mold. I looked at some of the office staff and I could see some telltale health issues with them. And I thought, these people are working here and I've got a feeling this is really bad. Anyway, I got an infrared camera out and I scanned the walls and I could see the walls look like they could be damp. So I got moisture meters out and the walls were saturated. Suddenly I saw a little girl. She was about 7 or 8. She was being dragged down the corridor to isolation zone. She was a pretty little girl. She looked like reminded me of granddaughter.
Mm.
And she was smartly dressed, and she didn't look like a naughty, nasty kid, but she was hysterical and she was as much as a teacher would drag, he was dragging her. And he took her to the end and sat her on a seat, and I was watching, and I thought, there's something wrong here, this. And then within minutes, I saw a little boy get dragged out of another classroom, and I saw 4 different children pulled out of classrooms and pulled to this isolation zone. And I thought, this looks like it's pans or pandas, and there's some major issues here. And I went in and I found that the teachers of one of the, let me get rid of that. I found that the teachers had actually put filing cabinets up against soft walls where kids had run into the walls or something and put holes in them. Because the
Wow.
walls that were plasterboard were so soft, you could punch it and put your fist through it. So the teacher had put cabinets in front of it, and they looked out of place, and so I moved them out the way and I could see what had been done. In one of the urinals, there was little boys' urinals. They'd put plastic bin bags across the underside of the urinal because that was soaking wet, and it had just been taped off. Now, this was the caretaker's attempt at trying to hold in contamination. Now, you're not going to hold this in, it passes through walls. Anyway, I did settled dust tests in the classroom. I did the settled dust tests in the common parts. I did air tests for toxigenic species, and it was, and then I did, because I thought some of these, quite often PANS is triggered by bacteria, so I did some bacteria tests. When children change, where they are, one day they're really sweetness and light and they're lovely, and the next day you really, really, really wish they belonged to somebody else that you could walk away from. And I know that happens to teenagers, but like, this is little kids, little cherubs, and I knew, or I guessed. Anyway, I took the bacteria tests that I hadn't been paid for. Now, they were quite expensive. And I took the bacteria test, and I thought I couldn't live myself if I didn't. And if they don't pay for it, I'll pay for it. And I'll cause them enough issues that they will pay for it. Anyway, it all came back extremely positive. The school was extremely toxic. The staff was exposed. The children were exposed. And the school should have been closed the next day. That's how bad it was. And I gave them a draft report before I even got the lab report. And I said, there's some really serious issues here. They didn't want to pay me. I waited 2 months to get paid because I don't think they had any money. This is a local authority, one of the richest local authorities. And anyway, I said, if I don't get paid, I'm taking this to the papers, which isn't a very wise thing to do if you want to work for somebody again. But I didn't think for 1 minute I'm ever going to work for them again. Anyway, they did pay, but I'm afraid there is an issue with public health and children's health, and I'm not having it when people in charge are not looking after kids. It's one thing for a landlord to ignore the pleas of an adult, but when a local authority puts children's lives at risk, and we're talking lives at risk, we're talking here that kids can develop some extremely serious, some of the bacteria that was growing there, they're called cyanobacteria, and they're often seen on the Mediterranean lakes in orange and green, vivid, or orange and blue, vivid algae on the sea bank, on the seashore, and people used to gallop their horses through it because it looked so beautiful, and the horses would fall over and drop dead.
Wow.
It's extremely toxic. This makes this, T2 toxin, which is one of the nastier toxins that produced by trichoderma and some of the other toxic molds, that turns off your immune system. My daughter had it, And I tell this story always, but my daughter was diagnosed with aggressive leukemia, and I she came and moved in with me because she just couldn't get out of a chair.
Mm.
Despite being a kickboxer, she just couldn't get out of a chair. And she laid on a settee in my home for 6 weeks, and suddenly she was better. And then I went round the house to get a book for her. And this was a brand new house. This house was 4 months old. And I got an itchy nosebleed within 5 minutes of it being in the house looking for a book. Me and her are very similar, genetic. And anyway, I found T2 toxin in her home,
Wow.
and it had simply turned off her immune system. And the hospital, University College, was sending an ambulance the next day to pick her up to start chemotherapy and radiotherapy. And I said no. And she made a total and full recovery. And, you know, and there's not enough known, and I'm afraid a lot of people don't want to know. And I don't know whether it's Big Farm that's doing the running here or what, but
I think to a certain extent, yes. I think it's really difficult, isn't it? Because when you're ill, and I've been ill myself, not necessarily through mold, although that could have had some effect. But you're just grabbing at straws, aren't you, to feel well again. And if someone's offering you a lifeline, unfortunately, that's probably the first thing you go for. And I learnt the hard way how, just being given pharmaceuticals was just like a Band-Aid, basically. It wasn't going to make me any better. Okay, it might make me feel slightly number against the pain for a minimal amount of time, but unless you get to the root cause of what's causing the issue in the first place, but you're never going to get fully healthy. And it does worry me that people get misdiagnosed all the time, and the things like mold could be like a really underlying issue for people. I worry about people with electrosensitivity issues as well. I've got a bunch of clients who are really sensitive to all the kind of Wi-Fi and 5G and everything that's going up, and whether there's a relationship between mold and electrosensitivity, we can save that for another time. But I'd love to know your thoughts on that, because I think people think I'm batty when I say that. I think there's probably
no, you're not batty. I mean, I can tell you now that I've got the evidence you want, and that's another podcast. But I saw a boy that was he developed PANS, and he was bedwetting, and he was in a terrible state, this little boy. And I did a survey at his house, and I found his head was next to the other side of an electric meter, one of the new.
Tell me what PAN
meters.
stands for, please.
What PANS? Oh, I can never remember it. It's,
okay, don't worry. I'll look it up and I'll add it. But yeah, sufficient enough to know that you should not have your head on the other side of an electrical cupboard.
Well, that's right. And this little boy, I said, and I got I try not to get too deep into it, because this is, dirty electricity, and EMF is a, pretty clever field. And I really haven't got time to study it in detail. But I've got the meters, and I just said, this little boy is getting cooked every night. Turn his bed round. I'll find another bedroom. And they just turned his bed round. And the mum phoned me up 2 weeks later crying, and she said, I can't believe it. She said, he stopped bedwetting and he's a different child. So
it's small things like that really kind of make me, I think kind of make me a bit happier, really, because it just shows you, because when I speak to people about how making your home healthier, everyone gets a bit overwhelmed because they just think, oh, it's so much, what can I do? But as you've just identified, sometimes making the smallest of changes can be really, really beneficial. And then obviously looking at, because people don't have the money necessarily to move or to put someone in another bedroom, but there are things that you can use to kind of mitigate against these things as much as possible.
Absolutely.
Which I think,
I mean, one of the things that I've found, I'm starting to see. I mean, I've been doing this 40 years, not to the same depth, but still to some quite depth. And one of the things that I'm finding now is I started to see a particular species of mold that's starting to become much, much more prominent. And I find it's on the roof of Chernobyl, growing towards the center core of the nuclear reactor. So it's eating gamma radiation, which, when you start saying, oh, I want to kill mold, here you've got mold eating gamma radiation, which is the ultimate sanitizing agent. And it's so good at eating it, they're actually going to put it on the outside of the International Space Station because it
Wow.
eats gamma radiation and protects the people inside. So we've got those growing in people's homes because there's so much radiation from Wi-Fi, Bluetooth, next door, their router, whatever. But it's worth considering if it's maybe not in your home, maybe it's next door or whatever. But I think what you're saying here is, there are so many things. We think we're using chemicals. I try to make my home as safe as I can, and my wife, she likes plug-in air fresheners. I'm under the thumb. I'm under the cosh. We've got them in every plug hole.
Oh my God, no, get rid of them.
Yeah. We've got potted plants. I mean, I go into people's homes and there's potted plants, and they get rid of the potted plants. They say, "Oh, but they're cleaning the air." The plant is, but the soil they're growing in has got penicillin all over the top. Oh,
Yeah.
I just did a little girl who's got pans, and I went into her home, and I went in there. They went away, and they had a dog. What they call it, a dog. This guy sits in their house and looks after the dog, and they didn't know I was coming. And I went into the house, and the dog had pooed all over the place. And of course, he was doing that anytime, anywhere, because that's what he wanted to do. So I did certain types of bacteria testing, and it's positive, and it's possibly what's causing this little girl to be sick.
Wow. Okay. Well, which is fascinating, right? Because that's the problem with medical care and health these days, is that when you go to the GP, you get 5 minutes, if you're lucky, basically to chat to them about, what your issue is. Generally, they're just giving you a pill in return. And no one's got any time or any ability really to ask about lifestyle questions. Maybe they might ask you about how well you're sleeping, but they're definitely not asking you if a dog's pooing around your house and you're not clearing it up.
And no one admits to that.
Oh, yeah,
no one admits to that.
Yeah, they wouldn't
and
admit to that
when
anyway.
when I go around looking for dust, and they say, "Oh, I haven't had the cleaner in this week," and this is 10 years of dust, and everybody's house is the same. I'm not there. I'm not a dust detective. I just want a bit of dust to see what the history of dust is, and people are defensive. Don't be defensive. It's like going to see I feel like sometimes I go into someone's home, and it's like I'm a fortune teller. I'm a gypsy fortune teller, and they don't want to show me the right. They want to show me the palm, and they don't want to show me the palm. They want to show me the top, and they don't want to give me any clues. And I say to them, "Listen, I can walk around this house all day guessing, but if you give me some clues, like, oh yes, we had a water leak up there, and we had a water leak there, and then I can focus on some of these areas and exclude them or confirm them."
Yeah.
And it is a detective, but like with a ton of equipment. So when people say they've got mold in their home, you know what? They're lucky. I'll tell you why they're lucky. They've got one of the only visible indicators that something's out of kilter, something's affecting their home that's suitable for mold. But before the mold grows, bacteria does, VOCs, lots of other things are starting to develop. And mold is just a visible indicator.
Yeah.
Lots of other things have already happened. So
Yeah.
don't just check for mold.
Yeah, that's interesting, actually. It's a bit like, having a rash or whatever on your body is an indication that something else is out of balance in your body. So it's interesting that you think of mold as the same, like, indicator of being out of balance in your home. I'll have to use that. That's a really good phrase. So let's go on.
Yeah, I went to my doctor when I couldn't walk or talk, and I struggled into the doctor. It was during COVID. And I said, and I couldn't go to my resources in the States. I couldn't go anywhere. And so I went to my doctor, as everybody does. I trust him. And he looked at me and he scribbled something. And I thought, oh, he's going to give me some cholestyramine or some glutathione or something. And he scribbled something, and he gave it to me. And I said, I can't read it. He said, look carefully. And it was how to improve your self-worth. I said, what, you think this is psychosomatic? and he just smiled at me. I could have punched him, you know. And I think, you know, I see the problems that everybody gets. I came away from there. I bought everything I could. I bought the magnetic mats. I bought the earthing. I bought the saunas, and I bought everything. And I looked at it all, and I thought, this isn't what's going to make me better, you know. And it was purely that I'd been massively overexposed, and, you know, just staying out of it was enough to start seeing me get better.
Yeah, interesting. I've actually got a couple of questions before I let you go that I really want to cover that will hopefully leave people with a bit of a more kind of positive kind of solution-based kind of approach. One is like, what can people do? What can parents do if they think that there's mold issues in the school? Because it worries me that, you know, the government are so strict. I don't have kids, but when I hear my friends talk about, oh, I can't take little Johnny out of school on that day or that day because I get fined massively, and, you know, they have to go to school every day. And then I'm like, well, you know, if there is a problem with the school building and it's making them sick, you know, obviously you don't want your child to go to school, but how, you know, what's the struggle there? What's the resistance there? And what can parents do that's in...
Okay. Right. First off, not all the kids will be affected. Only some. The some that will be affected will be the ones with the lower immune response, because they're the ones who don't eat maybe their greens. Maybe they don't eat meat. Maybe they don't eat a regular balanced diet. So they might be more immune sensitive. They might have the HLA gene, which makes them more sensitive. They might not get enough sleep. That might make them. So not all the children will be affected. Some will, some won't.
Mm-hmm.
But I think what should happen is that parents should get together and form a group, every school, because this is now a national issue. Every school should have a group of mums and dads, or mums, I suppose dads won't get involved, but the mums, and they say, right, have we seen any changes in our children's behaviour in the school or in classroom 1, 2, 5, 10, whatever it might be? What's the sickness levels of the staff, the teachers? How many teachers are going sick? How often are those teachers going sick? So we start to see some sickness patterns. I think that's quite reasonable that people can start to establish within a couple of months. One of the things they can do is say, well, I'm going to do a do-it-yourself dust test. Now, we've had parents call us and say, can you come and do a test in the school? The schools never want us to come in and do a test, because they're sort of admitting that there could be a problem, and they want to emphasise that there isn't. So what you do is you buy an ERMA. You can buy those from mouldlab.co.uk, and that's just a swab, and you just go in the school and just take some swabs from different areas. That costs you about £300, and it will give you a really good idea about what levels and species of potentially toxigenic mould will be in that area that you swab. Once you've got some issues on that, some evidence, and you take it to the head teacher and say, look, we've recorded that these children are getting sick. These people are not, you know, their marks are going down, or there's differences. And we've noticed that some of the teachers are getting regularly sick, and they're all in that classroom, or whatever. It's just developing some evidence. Or you can see some visible water damage. And if you've got visible water damage, you know that there is either hidden or visible mold or bacteria that's present. So there's risks. You've established risk. You might have established hazard. You might have established safety issues. Now the school has now got a duty to investigate. Now the biggest issue that they're going to get is that they will, they'll probably Google some, and they'll get some clown come along, and you know, and listen, it's not going to be me, because I can't possibly do every school in the country, but what it will be someone, and they will use the inappropriate testing. Now, what does that mean? If somebody said to me, I want you to test to prove this place is okay. I'll tell you what, I'm going to go one step further. I was just involved with some of the most expensive flats in the UK or Europe. The flats were £55 million each. And I did a survey in these properties for the owners who were sick, brand new, these places, by the way.
Wow.
And I think it cost them about £3,000 to have the survey done with lab data, lots of lab data. And it was sufficient to say to the people they bought the homes from, your building's sick.
Mm.
Then the people who own the building came to me and they said, we've got a lot more of these homes for sale and you've spoilt the sale value. What would it cost to prove that the house is safe? And I said, well, I think it's going to cost you about £20,000 per home. And they said, why? I said, because to prove something is unsafe is quite easy, but to prove something is safe is very difficult.
Yeah.
And that will take a whole battery of different tests. Now, I don't want people to run away and say, oh, well, like £20,000, who's going to pay that? No, I don't mean that. I just wanted to emphasise that there are levels of investigation, and that shouldn't, the cost of that should not fall on the parents. They shouldn't fall on the people. It should fall on those who are responsible for putting it right.
Yeah.
So, but any form of reasonable sampling is going to cost you £300. So, don't use culture plates because they're absolutely worthless. They only measure fast-growing moulds, and they only measure the moulds that will fall on them from certain distances. And of course, they won't measure dead mould or fragments. And the World Health Organization says culture-based sampling, which is little agar plates, has got serious limitations. So forget
That's
those.
interesting. That's really useful, actually. Thank you. That's a really good guide for people, I think. You've had so much experience being exposed to radiation, mold, and everything. Is there something that you do personally in your own health, looking after your own health, to get rid of kind of any mold in the body or radiation issues? Like, for example, do you use, I don't know, any supplements or any binders or any protocols that you use to look after your health?
I do take glutathione. I do take, I used to take a lot of alcohol, but I haven't had a drink for about 5 years. That was the best stress reliever for me. But no, I take glutathione, and I just take magnesium and just normal bits and pieces. Glutathione is the key, I think, for me. And I've also got a machine in my office which produces negative ions, and it's ultraviolet air cleaner. I mean, I've done tests with this where I've had people, I've had people come in here who can't walk or talk, and they sit in my lounge, and I put a telly on for them, and I wheel my machine into them, and I'll get them to do a VCS test, which is a visual contrast test. It measures brain inflammation through the optic nerve.
Wow.
And I get them to do a score, and a typical score might be about 85. And then they sit in the room exposed to clean air, which is now purifying the brain. There's no chemicals in it. It's just clean air. And they will increase their score by 60%, 70% after 1 hour.
Amazing.
Now, I found that when I was in Australia, when I was doing a survey with a company out there, and a lady who'd been bedridden for 2 years, we put the machine in her bedroom, and she got out of bed after about 45 minutes and come walking in, and nobody could believe that. Yeah, I mean, this sounds like a miracle. It is a miracle, but it's not a miracle, because when you think that the air that you breathe with the small fragments is going into your blood, is breaking the blood-brain barrier, is affecting your brain. And on my website, what I did is I had a brain scan done called a neuroquant. And although it's similar to an MRI, this does a volumetric measurement of each section of the brain. So you're measuring what these sections are against another section. And I got some pretty serious brain inflammation, which was causing all of my issues. Well, that's all reduced. I've still got some, and I've got some holes in the brain as well now. But you can measure when you get better with some processes, and
Yeah,
but
that's super interesting. What's that called? Neuroquant.
neuroquant, NEURQUANT.
Okay, that's really interesting.
Yeah,
Yeah,
it's
that's the next thing for me, I think, checking kind of brain capacity, because I like to do quite a lot of tests around, kind of metabolic health or
yeah.
biological kind of like testing. But some of the brain, I haven't done some kind of brain test, maybe because I'm worried about what I'm going to find out. But we'll
Well,
see.
my son, my youngest son, he went to school with a boy whose dad's the senior brain guru in London, private. Well, he was NHS, he's now private. And I took my neuroquant to him, and I said, "What do you make of it?" And he said, "There's nothing wrong." I said, "All right, thank you very much." So I went back to Dr. Schumacher in America, who I worked with Schumacher for 10 years.
Hmm.
And I was a co-author with him on a paper, on a consensus document. And I said to him, "Richie," I said, like, "my man in London says there's nothing wrong." And he just looked at me. He said, "I think you need another doctor, get a big," and he says, "Now this is a leading man." And I've been at, I think, 3 medical conferences where I've been asked to speak at universities, and one was at Harley Street, where the guy said, "Could you come at 6:15 and do a cheese and wine presentation for an hour?" I said, "Yeah, sure." Well, it went on for 4 hours, not because I wanted to, but because they just kept on and on and on, and we just kept expanding it. And these were all professors, and they said, "Jeff, we've never heard of any of this." Now, it's sad, isn't it, that when people are a professor and some of them were teaching at medical school, and they haven't heard of a neuroquant, or they haven't heard of a T2 toxin, or they
Yeah.
haven't heard of some of the issues that we know can affect your body, and they're unaware of them. It's not. I don't know whose fault it is, but if the General Medical Council isn't saying, "Oh, you need to have a look at this. This should be part of your CD, what do you call it, continuing
Training.
development." Yeah, it should be. It should be. Of course, it should, but it's
Yeah,
not.
well, look at the limited amount that anyone ever does on nutrition, unfortunately. And you would have thought that
Yes.
like one of the main things that you'd look at. But
Yeah. Yeah.
anyway, there are definitely changes we need to make in our system. But I don't want to go on and on and on and on like the professors. So I'm gonna ask you a last question, and then afterwards, if you wouldn't mind telling us where we can find you, where we can follow you. I'm obviously going to add links and everything to your website and everything else that you've mentioned that I think will be really helpful for people. But I really do want to ask you like a last question around where did we go wrong? Or do you think we've gone wrong somewhere in the last kind of, I don't know, 20, 30 years in terms of why we've got so many issues now with sick buildings and mold and, other issues like this? Do you think it's
Yeah.
something that we have caused ourselves as humans? Or do you think it's just that we're more aware of it now because we have much more access to the internet or to other information? Or where do you think,
No.
and do you think that we can turn that ship around, or we're just going to have to mitigate against it?
Do you know something? That's a really good question. And do you know something? When I was a kid, I grew up in a house, an old house. I don't even know how old it was. It was just so old. But we had gaslight. Um, I had ice on the inside of my windows. I used to chew the windowsills because I didn't know why. I didn't know why I chewed the windowsills until I don't know, 10 years ago. And the reason I chewed the windowsills was because the paint was lead. It was lead-based paint, and lead-based paint is sweet. So that's why I chewed the windowsills. So I grew up in a time when things were cold, and mold wasn't really. There was mold, but it was cladosporium, I've no doubt. and it was just a normal environmental mold. Today, and we all used to sit, I can remember sitting around the radio set
Hmm.
with a hat and a scarf on. Now, suddenly, we've now got where I sit around in my pants when I come home from work, and I just sit there. I expect to be warm. The windows and doors are shut. The house is ventilated when I'm not there or whatever. But I think that's generally everywhere, and people dry their wet. I mean, we had paraffin heaters, which produce as much water as the paraffin that you put in it. So walls were dripping wet, but there wasn't the amount of water because our homes are warmer, our homes are lighter weight. Now, plasterboard, I think, is one of the worst inventions for making people sick. Plasterboard. Okay. And then when they dot and dab it, they find an old building, an old Edwardian building, old Victorian building, and they say, oh, the walls are cracked, so we're going to put plasterboard on it. And they make it look like a brand new flat inside an old house. Almost always, people get sick. So plasterboard is the worst thing that we've done. We've cut the ventilation because of heating costs. So that's gone. I just did a study on a building where the people were getting sick, and I went in. This was a commercial building. Most of our work is domestic property, but I did a commercial job, and I went in there and they said, why am I here? Oh, well, one of the guys says he thinks the building's making him sick. I said, okay, where does he sit? Oh, he sits over there. I said, okay. I want to see human resources. I said, who's sick on a regular basis? Oh, well, him, of course. I said, okay, what days does he go sick? He always goes sick on a Friday. I said, why does he go sick on a Friday? Well, he wants a long weekend. I said, well, why don't he go sick on a Monday? I don't know. I said, well, it's a reasonable question, isn't it? I said, who else goes sick on a Friday? Oh, well, so-and-so does. And I said, where do they sit? They sit over there. And so, they sit over there. I said, okay, I want to see the facility engineer. So I see the facility engineer. Show me a diagram of your ventilation system. And then I find those desks are all on the same ductwork and they all affect each other. So I tested the ductwork and the ductwork was contaminated. And then they tell me, but this was all serviced 2 months ago and he's been going sick for 2 years. And I say, when they service it, they measure dust by the millimetre. I measure contamination with PCR DNA or a microscope. And the air that man and those people are breathing is extremely contaminated.
Wow.
So, yeah, it's different things. It's we're not getting enough fresh air. That's a certainty. We're not moving about. We're not eating the right food. And
the food that we are eating generally is kind of like quite contaminated with pesticides and God knows what. So then it's kind of weakening your body,
Well, it's something. It's funny, I go into homes and I go into some homes with some very, very healthy people, and they're very sick. Well, they look healthy. And I look on the side and they've got all the usual suspects of bottles and pills and inhalers and stuff. And then they've got all the jars with all these names of beans and pulses and stuff I've can't spell or never seen before. And I look at it all and I think they're eating organic food because they think it's good for them. Now, the real issue here is organic food will go off quicker. It goes off quicker because bacteria and mold get established fast on organic food. So you're not necessarily eating better eating organic, not necessarily. And I've got an issue with, maybe some of the old types of, pesticides. I looked at a house for a big paint company and they said, we've got 2 houses side by side. One is 10 years older than the other one. Can you tell which one? I said, well, the dirty one looks like it's probably 10 years older. And they said, no, that's the new one, and it's only 4 months old. I said, really? Why? What's happened? And they said, we changed the formula of our paint from oil-based to water-based. Well, that told me pretty much what's really happening all around us. We're reducing the toxic load of everything, and then everything else is starting to flourish. We
Huh.
need to kill maybe stuff, bacteria like and mold like to grow on water-based paint. That's in everybody's
Okay.
home. We put vinyl wallpapers on walls, and so suddenly the walls can't breathe. So we end up with mold behind the vinyl.
Hmm.
So it's those things, So one of the things I see is, people buy Faro and Ball paint, the really thick paint, really lovely paints and colours, and it's all when I walk in and the people are sick and I do an air test or something, and I say, "Did you buy Faro and Ball paint on that wall?" And they said, "Yeah, it's a lovely colour, isn't it?" I said, "Yeah, and it doesn't let the wall breathe. You might as well put polythene on it. It's so thick, the paint, that the wall can't breathe." So
Ah, interesting.
these are issues that you don't consider, but there's lots of them, I suppose. And you have to see them. I had a lady come up to me a little while ago, and she said, I was at an exhibition. She said, "Can you test for mercury?" I said, "I can, but why do you want to test for mercury?" She said, "My little boy, he's 8 years old, and he's got mercury poisoning." I said, "Oh dear." I said, "Has he got any fillings?" She said, "No, he hasn't got a single filling." I said, "Oh," I said, "Do you live near a crematorium?" And she looked at me. She said, "Yes, why?" I said, "Well, when they burn people, the mercury goes up the chimney and goes downwind. You must be downwind from a
Wow.
crematorium."
Oh God, that's such a horrible thought.
Yeah. And I thought she was going to faint. But, you know, I found that because I did an investigation into a farm where the cattle were producing mercury in their milk, and no one
Wow.
could understand why. And then I found out that there was a crematorium up the road,
Oh my
and that was
goodness.
just coming down, contaminating the grass, and they was eating it. So sometimes it this is what an environmental hygienist will do. Will look at the different issues, not just say, "Oh, you've got mold. That's what must have caused your leg to fall off."
Mm.
You've got to look at different things and add things together and look at a risk reduction and look at, people tell me what they want, and then I try to say, "Look, you don't want that. You need this." And then be honest with me. Tell me, you know, can you afford £1,000, or can you afford £2,000, or can you afford £8,000? They think, "Oh, he's going to charge me." No, I'm not. I'm going to say, maybe we want to find this and that's more expensive because we're going to do several rooms, whatever, but
Yeah.
of course, no one's going to trust me when I ask them if they can afford something. But I don't
Yeah.
know. Maybe the less air and the greyer I get, maybe people will start to trust me. I haven't got long to go. I'm not going to be
I
doing
know
this
what
for
you're
much
saying.
longer.
It's literally you have to kind of prioritize sometimes because otherwise the list goes on forever. I mean, it's the same when you look at anything in a home, trying to kind of make it healthier. Whether you're, I don't know, looking at putting in better acoustics or other kind of insulation. It's like the list goes on and on and on. It's endless. So basically, yeah, you have to prioritize. But
And you've got to be careful what you buy. I mean, I've been doing tons of work with people that are sick with PIV systems where Envirovent and New Air,
Mhm.
they're saying, "Oh, buy our PIV, it'll control the mold." Yeah, it'll control the mold, and it'll spread it around like you can't believe. And, I can't tell you how many homes I go in that's had a PIV system fitted. It sucks the air out of the loft and blows it all through your house. Well, if your loft is contaminated, and, what do you think? Do you think a loft might be more contaminated than your living
Yeah,
spaces?
absolutely, I would say.
So, but there's hundreds and thousands of these have been installed, and people are just getting sicker and sicker and sicker. And again, it's, I was just in Venice last week. I went to the Lido with my granddaughters who were over from Australia, and we've got a punt, and we was going up the river, and I looked at the walls that were nearly, I don't know, 1,500 years old, and we was going up and down in Venice, and Do you know, I never saw one drill hole for damp proof.
Wow.
And yet I go into houses up and down the country, they got drill holes all around the front, all around the walls. It's damp course injection. And I say to them, you really ought to research that because it doesn't work. Oh, no, it does. The company's giving us a 10-year guarantee. Well, it doesn't work. So, they won't be here in 10 years' time. And of course, they never are there in 10 years' time. But in Venice, there's not a single hole drilled because you know what? The water evaporates. And people now, what they did in Venice was they said, oh, well, buildings look ugly. They look beautiful, but they thought they looked ugly. So they put a stucco render on them to make them look more modern and prettier. Well, that caused the problems. So what have you got today? And I took loads of photographs. They started cutting off the stucco. We call it stucco. It's like you put
Yeah.
plaster on the outside. And they started taking it off because they realised it was trapping the moisture. So then someone come along and they put waterproof render on the outside. And of course, that caused more problems on the inside. So this is a city that's 1,500 years old, never had a problem until modern man starts to have a go at it. And then they change what the educated people who knew how to build buildings did. It doesn't make sense to me.
Does seem the way of everything. It feels to me that everything that we do in the name of progress, or to make our lives more convenient, does seem to kind of be bad for our health and be bad for the planet in the end. So I think we do need to go back to basics a bit. And on that note, I'm going to leave you in peace because I'm just conscious of your time. It's been such a great opportunity to be able to speak to you and hear all about your amazing experience and, all the amazing work that you do. And I'm sure that we're going to get an opportunity to speak again. At least I hope we will. And let everyone know where they can find you. Sorry, I will obviously put your website underneath, but where's the best place to get in touch with you if they need to?
Well, the website, it's got our email address and we've got a phone number on there. It's an answering service because, as much as I want to help everybody, what happens is people phone up and they want to discuss what they've heard on Google or whatever it is, and I haven't got time to challenge everything everybody says. So I just say, please put it on an email. Make it brief. Don't give me 40 pages. Just make it brief, and I'll help if I can. And I'm paying back as much as I can. I'm not, I try to do as much as I can for free, and I do tons. I do too much, but and then if someone wants me to come out, or I've got a couple of staff that will come out and do surveys and things like that, which is, can be helpful. But anyway, that's where you can get us on our website, buildingforensics.co.uk.
Brilliant, Jeff. Thank you so much for your time today. I really appreciate it. And it's been really informative for me. So I hope to get to speak to you again soon.
Hope so. And great questions, by the way, Charlie. Well done.